Hey everybody, I'm Emily Sweeney from the Boston Globe. I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of 3 Requests, 3 Stories. This webinar is part of our ongoing series on New England state public records laws. And you be sure to check out our previous episodes, which can be found on the New England First Amendment Coalition's YouTube channel and also the NEFAC website, nefac.org. That's nefac.org. And click on our Freedom of Information guide and you'll find tons of great information, and you can check out these previous episodes. This video series is brought to you by NEFAC with support from the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, MuckRock, SPJ New England, and the New England Society of News Editors. And leading today's session, I want to give a great welcome to Todd Bookman from New Hampshire Public Radio.
Hi, thank you so much. So I am not going to go over the ins and outs of New Hampshire's right to know law. I think there's other resources that are going to be way more valuable than I could possibly be on that topic. I use the law. I know it a little bit, but there's certainly other experts out there that would be better suited for that. This is the preamble, though, of the statute of 91A. And if you're looking for a little bit of motivation, this could be good for you. It's always nice to know that what you're doing is essential to a democratic society. That's the way we should think of filing our right to know requests. So getting on with the business of being essential for democracy. So I thought what would be best is a quick overview. So here is what is usually available under the state's right to know law. These are things that, broadly speaking, you can usually get your hands on. There's certainly probably situations where you can't, but broadly speaking, you can get access to meeting minutes, lawsuit settlements when a government agency is involved in that lawsuit. You can get police records, police files. Once that case is closed, those generally exist within the police department. Court records for both ongoing and closed cases are almost always made available to the public unless they're under seal for some specific reason. You can get salaries of public officials. You can generally get body cam footage of police when there is a shooting or it is a felony case. Those are kind of the cases that have been carved out. There is no automatic access to police body cam footage, but that is actually a very new area of law in New Hampshire. We're just sort of rolling out extensive body cams. So I suspect we'll see more on how those records play out in the future. And then lastly, this huge sort of category, which isn't necessarily defined in the statute, and it's just called, government records. You could think of that as everything that may sit in a file cabinet somewhere. That's how I think of it. So here are some things that are not usually available, things you're not going to be able to request through a right to know, or if you do, likely to be denied in some form. Can't get access to birth or death certificates, the actual copies of those in New Hampshire. Marriage licenses, I don't think you can get divorce records either. I may be wrong about that one. You're not going to be able to get driver's license records. As far as I know, you can't get public school student records, of course. Most things that live in personnel files of state employees or government employees, you're generally not going to have access to. Tax filings, you're never going to get that information. You also usually can't get what are called the rough drafts of anything that the government produces. So a memo, a document, a policy paper, everything that went into that sausage is usually not requestable. Usually only final copies of documents are what the agency will produce. 911 calls. I've never successfully gotten the audio of a 911 call. There may be case law out there. There may be examples where that could be acquired, but I've never been successful with that. And then there's this interesting thing. Basically, the entire governor's office is generally considered unfoyable. The governor's office, not just the current governor, Governor Sununu, but even previous governors, everybody always claims sort of executive privilege for lots of what happens within the governor's office. There are lawsuits actively right now in front of the New Hampshire Supreme Court over that issue. It's bigger than I understand or can get into at the moment. I did want to spend just another minute talking about a very specific type of record. I know NEFAC has another video about this on their website, but there's a really interesting thing happening right now in the state of New Hampshire about access to police misconduct, allegations or records, investigations into police misconduct. A really seismic shift because for about the last 25 years, the public had no access to these records. There was this Supreme Court case, Union Leader versus Fenneman, that controlled, and basically all police misconduct records were considered personnel. You couldn't get your hands on them. But then last year, 2020, the court issued a landmark series of rulings, 2 consecutive cases. They were released on the same day. They were kind of related, that laid out a new system by which these records are decided whether or not they can be made public or not. Essentially, what the court wants judges to do is perform a balancing test. So let's say I sue to get an investigation into the Concord police officer was accused of doing something. They don't want to release it. The officer doesn't want it released. NHPR wants it. What's supposed to happen now is that we would go to court over this, and the judge has to make a decision. The judge has to decide whether or not that record is in the public interest or whether the privacy rights of that officer outweigh that public interest. And so that is now playing out sort of in real time here in New Hampshire, where we have these a number of cases moving forward where we've got a lot of investigations that may or may not be released based on this balancing test. So it's a really interesting area of right to know law in New Hampshire that sort of, happening in real time. So for state government in New Hampshire, most agencies, what you'll do is you'll submit your right to know request to a public information officer, the PIO, the FLAC. Usually just email them the right to know directly, either in the body of the email or as an attachment. Not every state agency has a PIO. In those cases, you would submit to maybe the commissioner or the commissioner's office, their assistant, or maybe you know who the legal counsel is for the agency. You can usually find somebody to submit it to, or you can just call and ask who handles right to know requests. For local police, you usually can submit it to the chief of police. If it's a city, most cities have their own solicitors. You would submit the right to know to that person. At the town level, it's usually either the clerk or the town administrator. There can be sort of wrong doors, you can send it to a dead end, but most often what I found is that most people in state government and local government, they know these things come in and they know how to get them to the right person. But I have also found it can be really helpful to call first, if you can, just to give that agency a heads up, or at least double check who you can send that record to. So what does a right to know look like? Well, there's a lot of different forms of it. This is what I generally use and what most people in our newsroom use. We try to keep it very simple. A subject line of right to know. The first sentence here that I'm writing you is very boilerplate. The meat of the right to know request, what I try to do is I put it in bold. I use a bullet. I try to make it very clear what it is that we're actually requesting, and you're generally requesting copies of something. So this is a sample where we were seeking from the Department of Health and Human Services. This was forget when this would have been, maybe February or March. We were trying to get a handle on how many vaccine doses had been wasted, had either been, maybe dropped, broken in shipment, maybe been left out of the refrigerator too long, things like that. This was sort of early in the vaccine rollout. So this is how I worded that request, submitted it to DHHS. They, as an agency in the state of New Hampshire, they have 5 days to get back to me, not necessarily with the information, but at least to acknowledge receipt of that right to know. And they're supposed to give you a timeline for when that right to know will be fulfilled based on, what they think they'll need to do to get it accomplished. Okay, so tonight's event is called 3 Stories. So I'm going to get right now into story number 1. So this story, here's the context. So this was summer of 2020. Our newsroom was really interested in sort of following up on the police killing of George Floyd. We wanted to know more about allegations of civil rights abuses made against New Hampshire law enforcement officers. And we drilled down on what we thought may be publicly available on this. And ultimately, what we decided is that we wanted to find records of settlement payments. So these are payouts made to a person who has alleged that their civil rights were violated by a law enforcement officer. These payouts are made by either the town or the city. They're actually paid for by an insurance company almost always, but these payments have been made to end the allegation. It's not necessarily an admission of guilt. Sometimes the town would decide just to settle these things because it's cheaper than fighting it at trial. The issue is these settlements don't live in any one place. There's no central repository. Our police certification agency doesn't keep them. Our courts, they're in the court system, but they don't have a designated file where these may exist. essentially, these settlements live in each town and city in the state of New Hampshire. The town halls are kind of required to hold on to these documents. So we submitted right to know requests. And I'll let you read through that as I ramble on here. Essentially, what we wanted from each town and each city that we requested was 10 years worth of records. And we knew that these settlement documents were usually in this kind of legalese form, this probably 5 to 10 page document that kind of laid out the terms for settling the case. So initially what I did is I sent this to the 10 largest cities in the state of New Hampshire. For these, I had to look up the police chief or the city solicitor for each one because there's no way to automatically file this. It would wind up taking a few minutes for each of those 10 requests. So I had them all done about under an hour. I would say I had them out the door. So I did the math and I realized, well, I could do maybe the 25 largest municipalities in the state. That wouldn't take so long, maybe a few more hours of work. So I slowly chipped away at that. And then with my editor's sort of permission, I decided that I was going to spend a lot of time doing this and I was going to get one of these right to knows out to every single town in the state. So that's more than 230 right to knows that we sent out to every town, every city, the 10 sheriff's offices, and the state police, right around 230 right to know requests. Again, this exact wording was sent to all of them, but we had to look up the email addresses for each. And that's kind of what took all that time. I wound up creating a spreadsheet just to track these because it just became so unwieldy. So I had a column for when I submitted it, who I submitted it to, did I get the initial response within 5 days, and then ultimately, what did I get back in return from these government entities? And over about the next 6 or 8 weeks, it took for all the towns to comply, but I got copies of about 80 settlement records, maybe 85, I forget the exact number. There weren't a ton of details in these records, but they did give the dollar amount of the settlement and also usually the date of the incident in question where this alleged incident took place and the victims' names. And with that, then I could go into the court files and look up and find the original complaint, the detailed complaint of exactly what people alleged the police officer had done to them. And so with that, I kind of knew the whole story of a lot of these 80 incidents. And with that, I was then able to write sort of a narrative and a story. The end result was a story that ran during All Things Considered. It was a radio story. We had a web piece. We created a map based on all these right to know requests. So you could look up your town to see how many settlements had been paid out and the dollar amounts. All in, I think it was a 2 or 3 month reporting project that I think ultimately was kind of worthwhile. But I do think this is a good right to know request for folks who want to either get their feet wet doing this kind of thing where you can submit to your town or your city to see what kind of records may be available, or this other model of really going big and trying to get a piece of information from every town in the state. Here's a way you can sort of do that as long as you submit the same one to every town. So that is story number 1. I'm going to move on now to story number 2. So this is an example of another right to know request that I think is really valuable and could be copied quite easily. It has to do with requesting invoices. Anytime a government entity cuts a check, there's usually going to be a corresponding invoice or a receipt for why that money was spent. So early in the pandemic, Dean Kamen, the businessman, the inventor, the guy who invented the Segway, he made headlines in the state of New Hampshire because he was able to secure these plane loads full of PPE, of gloves and gowns when these things were in really short supply. And there were these photo ops on the tarmac and press conferences and all that. And we covered this a bit for New Hampshire Public Radio. And then for reasons that are completely beyond me, one day this summer, I was spending time on a website called Transparent NH. This lists every payment the state of New Hampshire makes to entities. Again, I don't know why I was doing this, but I just plopped in the name of Dean Kamen's company, DECA, and I was surprised to see that there were more than $80 million worth of payments made to Dean Kamen. $80 million is a really large number. That's a lot of hospital gowns and gloves, and it seemed to be just way more than had been announced previously to the public. So we decided to file a right to know asking for all the invoices received by the state. I'll bring that up here. So that's the right to know request that we filed. We wanted all of these invoices. That second bullet point, because this database transparent NH lists the transaction IDs for each payment. I included that because I didn't want to put the state through more work than was necessary. I knew exactly the transaction, so I just wanted the corresponding invoices if those existed. So I tried to be helpful in including those on a separate page. So I submitted this to the state government, and we got back a whole bunch of invoices. I think it was 50 or 60 pages worth of documents. And with those, we were actually able to start piecing together this really interesting thing that was happening with Dean Kamen and his company DECA. So Kamen was selling the PPE products to both the state and the federal government, the federal VA. But all of his federal VA transactions were still running through state government. It was almost like the state of New Hampshire was acting as a middleman for a private business here. And so this is how it would ultimately work in practice. So Kamen would negotiate an order with the VA. Let's say they wanted X thousand surgical gowns. He would front the money, he would buy the goods, he would have them imported, they'd be delivered to the VA. But instead of billing the federal VA directly, he would actually bill the state of New Hampshire. And that's because the state and the VA could exchange money more quickly with less red tape. It meant Kamen didn't have to register as a federal vendor. And so the VA would pay the state and the state would pay Kamen. And that's why those invoices wound up totaling so much money. It was the total sales, not only to the state, but also to the VA. And it was this very sort of special, unique financing arrangement that was made available to nobody else in the state except for this sort of well-connected businessman. So it was a very sort of interesting process to piece this together and to look through the invoices. Maybe my takeaway here could just be that invoices are public. They're all public. And so filing a right to know, this could be a good example of another sort of easy lift for folks maybe trying to submit their first right to knows or just get a little bit more experience. You can submit right to knows to your local town or your police department, asking for something that they have spent money on or a contract. This should be a pretty straightforward request that I think folks could mimic to good effect. All right, so story number 3. So this is from a few years ago. I happened to do a lot of reporting on what was at the time New Hampshire's best-selling liquor. This is Hennessy Cognac. I have a prop here because I keep this on my desk. Didn't know there were going to be props. Okay, but nobody knew that Hennessy Cognac was actually the best-selling liquor in the state of New Hampshire. That is not public information. And we're going to back into how we kind of pieced all this together. Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't get that through a right to know. Someone leaked me those records. I had to meet them in a parking lot, and they handed me a file full of documents about the best-selling liquors in the state. And so, as fun as right to knows are, sometimes it's better to just have good sources who can leak you things. But anyways, the Hennessy papers. This story got started because a local politician in New Hampshire kind of came forward with these concerns about allegations of bootlegging. So people were driving up from mostly the state of New York. They're driving to New Hampshire, where we have low-cost, cheap liquor, plentiful highway rest stops for them. People were buying essentially van loads full of Hennessy Cognac and then returning to the state of New York and reselling the Hennessy. The price differential was so great that even all that gas mileage was worth it, and it was worth it for people to come to New Hampshire to buy all that Hennessy Cognac. And they were doing it with cash because this isn't exactly a legal transaction. You're not supposed to import things into other states, liquors without paying certain excise taxes. And people were spending a whole lot of money in cash, and the IRS monitors cash transactions, or they're supposed to, they want to, whenever there's more than $10,000 in cash exchanged. And so these bootleggers, knowing this policy, they were driving from store to store to store. The New Hampshire liquor stores, there's 70 of them across the state, 80 of them across the state. And they would load up, they would get $5,000, $8,000, $9,000 worth of Hennessy Cognac, then go to the next store. So they were always selling under $10,000 in cash in order for these not to be tracked. So we filed this initial story that looked into this politician's allegations. And then to go a bit deeper, or at least try to, I wound up filing about a dozen right to know requests over the next few weeks, maybe few months. Some of those right to know requests bore fruit, others didn't. I'm just going to read them in sort of no specific order, just to give you a sense of how I tried to use right to knows, what I thought were sometimes simple right to knows, to continue advancing this story, the allegations of bootlegging going on at the New Hampshire Liquor Commission. So first thing I requested was IRS forms used to track all those transactions in excess of $10,000. So I took this hunch that maybe people didn't know this rule and had spent over $10,000 at a time. And so I filed a right to know request to get copies of those forms. We asked for the employee manual and the specific instructions for how these cash transactions were actually being handled at the cash register. They happen so often at the New Hampshire Liquor Commission that there are actually rules about how employees in these liquor stores are supposed to handle them. They close the lane off, they pull out these cash counting machines. So we got those instructions. We asked for all the sales data related to Hennessy Cognac. That was actually denied. At that time, the head of the union that represents the rank and file workers at the Liquor Commission, they were spatting with sort of management. And so we asked for grievance documents. And then we also got settlement documents related to an employee who was fired for leaking some information about bootlegging. So that was another right to know request. One day I was in a New Hampshire liquor store, not reporting, just being a customer. And I noticed that an armored car had pulled in and that a guy had come in and picked up a bag of cash. I sort of watched this happen. And so then I went back and I filed a right to know request to get the contract for the armored car company, because that is not something that had been publicly reported. So we were able to break that story. We also would learn that the IRS was actively, I don't know if investigating is the right word, but they were looking into these transactions and how the New Hampshire Liquor Commission was handling these sales. So we filed several right to know requests for all those communications and payments that the New Hampshire state government was making to attorneys to represent them in this dispute. I asked for a variety of meeting minutes from the Liquor Commission's agendas. And then last but not least, I asked for every email sent or received in the previous 2 years that contained the word Hennessy. And this request, it wound up taking more than a year for the Liquor Commission to process, but much to their credit, they got it done. And, you could actually argue that they overcomplied because they wound up giving me tens of thousands of pages of records. I have more props. So they were delivering them to me sporadically on USBs that I would pick up like every 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And I have a ton of these USBs that had all the emails on them. And they were a lot of inventory reports, which wasn't all that helpful for the story. And took me a lot of time to sort of sift through these things to try to find information that would actually be helpful for the story. And so I'll wrap this up by saying, I think my last sort of pearl of wisdom is that while casting a wide net like that, while asking for all of these emails was ultimately a good thing, it probably would have been better for me and for the Liquor Commission if we had just gotten on the phone at some point and said, like, look, this is what I'm looking for. I don't need those inventory reports because they don't really tell me what I'm looking for. And so most of the time, state government, local government are willing to talk through these records requests because they don't want to do more work than is required. And from my perspective, I don't want them to. I want what I want as fast as possible.
This was great. It was really eye-opening to see like the different records that, aren't allowed and, are inaccessible usually. Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. And for this webinar, please check out the previous episodes as well on NEFAC's YouTube channel and the NEFAC website. And yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you. Take care.